There are moments in the history of mankind that are spoken of only in whispers, not because they are forgotten, but because to remember them is to feel the weight of what should never have happened. The burning of the Emperor's own sons was one such moment. In the twilight of the Great Crusade, before the galaxy was drowned in betrayal and ash, the Emperor of mankind made a decision that even his most loyal warriors could not understand. It was not born of anger, nor vengeance, nor pride, but of necessity. A single act that would carve a scar into eternity, one so deep that even the warp recoiled at its echo. It was said that on that day the stars themselves dimmed, as though creation mourned the cost of its own salvation. If you wish to witness that moment, to see the Emperor not as a god, but as a man who bore the unbearable, then join us. Subscribe your vigilance, share this remembrance, and let these forbidden truths echo once more across the Imperium. They were called gods once, long before the universe had learned to fear their names. The Primarchs, 20 sons forged from the Emperor's own hand, born of science, will, and something deeper that none dared name. They were not children in any mortal sense, nor soldiers bound by mere duty. They were reflections, each one a fragment of his design, shaped to carry the light of humanity to the furthest corners of a broken galaxy. But even perfection casts a shadow, and in the age of fire that followed, those shadows began to grow. The Great Crusade had entered its zenith. Worlds once lost to barbarism knelt beneath the imperial Aquila, their skies split by the golden fleets of the Imperium. From the black heart of Terra to the edges of the halo stars, the Emperor's legions marched in unison. The galaxy trembled not beneath the tread of tyrants but under the promise of order. And yet, beneath the triumph, beneath the hymns and banners and the roar of conquest, there was unease. The Primarchs were not like their father. Each bore his genius, his fury, and his vision, but none bore his restraint. They were human enough to feel love, anger, and doubt, yet too divine to be contained by them. Some led their sons with the patience of saints, others with the fury of old gods. Among them, rivalries became unspoken wars of pride, and victories became monuments to ego. The Emperor saw it all, the brilliance, the chaos, the inevitable fracture, and he said nothing. For he still believed that unity could endure, even when the hearts that carried it began to burn. In those days, the Emperor did not walk among them as a god. To his sons, he was a father and a ruler, distant, flawless, inscrutable. He had not yet ascended to the golden throne, nor had his silence become the law of eternity. He spoke in reason, in command, and in promise. Yet even then, some of his sons began to question the truth behind his words. What was the Imperium's purpose if not to free mankind? What price would be paid for order? And if the Emperor was the pinnacle of human creation, what right had he to deny divinity to those who bore his own blood? It began quietly. Subtle deviations in doctrine, unsanctioned experiments, wars fought longer than necessary under the banner of purity. The Emperor's word was still law, but his reach could not be everywhere. Some Primarchs had begun to shape their legions in their own image, rewriting oaths, changing rituals, replacing loyalty to Terra with loyalty to themselves. To the common soldier, the difference was invisible, but among the custodes and the sigillites' agents, alarm bells began to sound. Something within the Emperor's creation had begun to evolve beyond its intent. One night, or what passed for night in the lightless chambers beneath the palace, the sigillite met with the Emperor. The records of their conversation were erased long ago, yet whispers remain in the archives of the Inquisition. It is said that the sigillite, ever the keeper of reason, warned his master that the Primarchs were diverging, that their perfection was too fragile, too human. They are not gods, he said. They are mirrors, and if a mirror stares too long into the sun, it cracks. The Emperor did not answer. He only turned his gaze toward the void above Terra, where the stars burned like distant candles, each one a world reclaimed, each one a promise fulfilled. He had loved his sons as only a creator could, but even love in its purest form carries the seed of judgment. Rumors began to spread across the fleets. Whole systems were brought to compliance not by negotiation but by annihilation. A single Primarch, it was said, had glassed 3 worlds for failing to kneel. Another had begun constructing statues of himself, taller than any shrine to the Emperor. And another, whose name the Mechanicus later struck from record, had begun experiments on human souls. Whether the Emperor knew of it, none could say. But the custodes began to move in secret, their golden armor unseen in the void. To the legions, this was an age of glory. To the Emperor, it was the calm before the fall. For he had seen this before, in the elder races who had risen and perished, in the gods of old who had destroyed themselves in pursuit of perfection. Humanity was to be different. It was to endure, and for that endurance something or someone it would have to burn. In the final days before the fire began, the Emperor withdrew from the front lines. His sons, puzzled and proud, continued the crusade without him. His silence was interpreted as trust. In truth, it was sorrow, for he knew that the greatest threat to his Imperium would not come from Xenos or the Warp, but from the very beings who carried his light. It is said that on the night before he left the stars for Terra, he stood upon the bridge of his flagship and watched the galaxy burn with the light of conquest. A custodian approached and asked, "Do you see victory, my lord?" And the Emperor, without turning, whispered, "No, I see the day I must end it." The day would come when the stars themselves would dim in mourning, when the Emperor of mankind, the Father of gods, would look upon his sons and see only fire. The first cracks did not come with rebellion, but with reverence. The more victories the legions won, the more distant their father became, and in that distance they began to build gods of their own. The Emperor had forbidden worship, yet devotion has a gravity that cannot be denied. His image appeared on banners, his words became liturgy, and in the silence of his absence his sons began to interpret his will in their own reflection. To the legions, their primarchs were divine, not as men but as living ideals. To follow them was to touch perfection, and as the galaxy knelt beneath the imperial Aquila, a question grew in the hearts of men and demigods alike. If the Emperor's sons were born from his essence, were they not also part of his divinity? If the light of humanity was infinite, could it be divided without diminishing? Such thoughts were not heresy yet. They were curiosity and ambition wrapped in loyalty. But ambition, left ungoverned, has the same nature as flame. It seeks to consume. Among the legions, brotherhood gave way to rivalry. The first, proud and unbending, saw themselves as the truest reflection of the Emperor's discipline. The second, more visionary, sought knowledge beyond the veil, claiming they could improve upon his design. The third, zealous and radiant, believed purity could only be achieved through cleansing, even if that meant turning their fury upon their own kin. The others watched in silence, bound by loyalty and fear, uncertain of how close perfection could stand to madness before the two became the same. When the Emperor returned to Terra, he brought with him neither victory nor joy. His face, hidden behind light, bore the stillness of a man who had seen the end and refused to speak it. The custodes sealed the palace gates behind him. The Sigillites' agents purged the archives. For decades, the Great Crusade continued without its master, led by sons who did not yet know they were walking toward the pyre. The first reports of deviation reached Terra in fragments, intercepted vox logs, corrupted data slates, confessions torn from dying lips. Entire planetary populations vanished under compliance, their surfaces scorched to glass. A legion once known for precision had begun to deploy weapons of planetary eradication without sanction. Another had ceased answering the vox entirely, their transmissions replaced by hymns in no human tongue. And in the far reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus, a forge world burned for 7 nights under its own suns before vanishing from the Astronomican's sight. It was not until the return of the Invictus Solis that the truth became undeniable. The ship arrived in orbit above Terra, its hull blackened, its vox grills silent. Custodian boarding parties found its corridors filled with ash, not bodies, but ash shaped like men still kneeling in prayer. At its core they discovered a single figure, encased in armor that had fused into molten glass. Upon the breastplate, barely visible through the burn, was the sigil of one of the Emperor's lost sons. The Emperor stood over that relic for hours. He said nothing. When at last he spoke, his voice carried neither anger nor sorrow, only inevitability. It has begun. In that moment, the Sigillite realized what his master already knew. There would be no redemption. The design had faltered, and the flaw lay not in the sons but in the Father who had made them. They were too close to divinity to obey it, too bound to their own vision to yield. And in that paradox the future of mankind trembled. It is said the emperor did not weep, that he could not. But witnesses, few, and now long vanished, claimed that when he turned from the chamber, the light around him dimmed, and for the first time in memory, the air of the palace grew cold. From that day forward, no record spoke the names of the two lost legions. Their banners were removed, their histories erased. Their sons were unmade not through battle, but through silence. What remained of their fleets was drawn to Terra under false summons and sealed in orbit. The order was simple, spoken only once. None may speak of them again, but even silence has weight. It bends the soul. It carries meaning that cannot die. The surviving Primarchs felt the absence in their blood, like phantom pain where kin once stood. They did not ask their father what had been done. They already knew. The Emperor's work would continue. The Great Crusade would burn on. But from that day, every victory tasted of ash and every prayer carried a shadow. The Sons of Fire still marched beneath banners of gold, yet behind their triumph lay the first sin of the Imperium, for the Emperor had set his hand against his own. And though the galaxy would never learn their names, the echoes of their fall would haunt humanity until the stars themselves went dark. It began as a whisper in the data streams, an echo buried in static, dismissed by the Mechanicum as cosmic interference. Yet within that whisper lay the seed of the Imperium's first betrayal, a frequency pattern too deliberate to be random, too human to be chance. It was a message, though none alive could trace its source. Only the Emperor, locked within his private chambers, understood its meaning, the song of rebellion beginning to stir in his own blood. On the battlefields of the Great Crusade, victory still came swift and absolute. Entire systems surrendered at the sight of the Legion's banners. But behind the triumph marched something unseen: doubt, pride, fear. Some of the Primarchs began to view the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra not as strategy, but as abandonment. They had conquered in his name, bled entire stars dry to forge his vision, and now he sat in silence upon a world they barely remembered. Their brothers questioned, and questioning became doctrine. Among the legions, the first rifts were small, subtle changes in oath and prayer, a word here, a symbol there. One Primarch began to replace the imperial aquila on his banners with a personal sigil, a blazing sun devouring a smaller star. Another outlawed the use of Terran dialects among his soldiers, claiming the language of old Earth weakened their purity of purpose. When word of this reached Terra, it was dismissed by the Administratum as tactical eccentricity. But the custodes who recorded these deviations knew better. They had seen this before, in the ruins of dead empires that thought themselves eternal. The Emperor had not been idle. Beneath the palace, in vaults no mortal eye had ever seen, he worked in secrecy with the sigillite, crafting a machine that would one day sustain his will beyond flesh. It was a project that demanded all his genius, and all his faith that humanity could bear such silence without collapsing. He underestimated both the scale of his son's pride and the fragility of the faith he had built. The first world to burn was Orestes IX. Official records listed as an exterminatus order, justified by planetary contamination. In truth, it was punishment. The Second Legion, whose name is lost to history, had begun to experiment with the genetic foundation of humanity itself. They called it improvement. They called it ascension. They believed that by perfecting the Emperor's own work, they could free him from the burden of imperfection. But their creations, half flesh, half light, were abominations, blasphemies that wept for their own existence. When the Emperor learned of it, he did not rage. He wept. Then he unleashed fire. Orbital bombardments rained upon the surface for 6 days and 6 nights until the seas boiled, and the very crust turned to glass. Not one gene laboratory survived. Not one soul was spared. The Legion itself was summoned to Terra and never seen again. The surviving records speak only of the Emperor walking alone across the wasteland that had once been Orestes, his armor blackened by ash, his expression unreadable. The galaxy would never know this story. The sigillite erased it from every archive, every record, every mouth that had spoken it. But the Primarchs felt the tremor in their blood. They knew one of their brothers was gone, and though they did not speak it, the truth burned behind their silence. For the Emperor, it was a warning. For his sons, it was a revelation. Perfection was not divine, it was disposable. If even one of them could be erased, then all of them could. And from that realization, the first cinders of doubt became flame. Rumors spread among the fleets of a hidden war. Custodian strike teams seen vanishing into the void. Fox intercepts of legions clashing in silence far from the eyes of the Imperium. To the ordinary soldier, it was madness to imagine brother turning against brother. To the Primarchs, it was inevitability. In the vaults of the Mechanicum, a Magos recorded a vision received through his augmetic dreams. He wrote of seeing the Emperor upon a throne of fire, his sons kneeling before him as their armor melted and their eyes burned like dying stars. They will call it justice, the Magos wrote, but it will be mourning disguised as law. He was executed for heresy the next morning, and yet, his words were prophecy. The Emperor had burned his own creation to preserve humanity, but in doing so, he had taught his surviving sons the one lesson that would one day unmake everything he built, that even gods can be slain by their own fire. The first legion was gone. The second would follow, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the flame that would one day consume the galaxy took its first breath. The silence that followed Orestes 9 was the kind that could suffocate a man's soul. It spread through the legions like a phantom presence, unspoken yet unmistakable. The knowledge that one of their own was gone, erased so completely that even memory recoiled from naming him. The Emperor's decree was absolute: no song, no record, no mourning. To speak the name of the fallen legion was to invite annihilation. And so the galaxy forgot. But the sons of the Emperor did not. They felt it in their bones, that emptiness where once a brother's laughter had filled the void. Even the warp seemed to recoil from that loss, rippling with echoes of something holy made unholy. The Emperor continued his work in silence, his focus turned entirely to the project beneath the palace, the vast machine that would one day bridge his mind to the Astronomican. But the silence he left in his wake was not peace. It was a wound, and his sons began to fill it in their own ways. Some responded with devotion. They doubled their worship, turning discipline into obsession, loyalty into religion. They prayed not to gods, but to a father who had forbidden prayer, their faith reshaping his image into something even he could no longer control. Others responded with defiance. If one brother could be erased, then the Emperor's perfection was a lie. They had been taught to bring enlightenment to humanity, yet now they saw only obedience demanded at the cost of identity. The seeds of rebellion were not born in hate, but in grief. It was then that the Second Legion vanished. Not destroyed, and vanished. Entire fleets gone dark. Vox transmissions ceased mid-sentence. Worlds they had conquered went silent, their orbiting satellites transmitting only static and light. When the Mechanicus sent their data probes, they found nothing. No wreckage, no life. Just empty cities still burning as though abandoned in the instant of some divine judgment. The Emperor called no council. No Primarchs were summoned. No declarations were made. But those closest to him, the custodes, the sigillite, the psychers who served in the inner sanctum, felt it. The psychic shock of another bond severed. Two names erased, two brothers gone. The legions that remained felt the void between their ranks widen, and in that void trust began to wither. Among them, the whispers began again. The first spoke of divine punishment. The fifth claimed it was an act of mercy. The eighth swore it was madness. But none dared confront the Emperor. His silence had become something far more powerful than words. It was judgment embodied, a stillness that made even the immortal tremble. There were moments recorded only in rumor, when even the most loyal among the Primarchs sought answers and were met with nothing. It is said that on one such night Rogel Dorn himself descended into the catacombs of the palace to seek an audience. When he emerged hours later, his armor was scorched, and his face, normally carved in stone, bore the haunted look of one who had seen something he wished he could unsee. After that night, he never asked again. The loss of the Second Legion marked the end of the Crusade's innocence. For the first time, the Primarchs began to look upon one another not as brothers but as potential threats. Alliances formed quietly, some bound by loyalty, others by fear. And though the wars continued, their purpose had changed. The galaxy was no longer being conquered for unity. It was being carved into legacy. Each Primarch sought to leave his mark before the shadow reached him too. The Emperor knew it. The sigillite knew it. Perhaps even the custodes did. but to act too soon would shatter what remained of the Imperium's fragile faith. Humanity needed the illusion of divine control, even if the gods themselves were breaking beneath it. And so the Emperor's silence deepened. His golden armor no longer shone in the light of battlefields. His words came only through decree, and his sons began to mistake his distance for disdain. The warp, ever hungry for emotion, felt that fracture and stirred in delight. In its depths, something vast and formless listened to the grief of demigods and began to echo it back as temptation. In the decades that followed, the records speak of worlds burning without command, of entire fleets vanishing in lightless space, of Primarchs seen standing motionless aboard their flagships, listening to voices no mortal could hear. The chain of command became a web of secrets, and in the center of that web sat the Emperor, working in silence toward a salvation that none around him could comprehend. He had not meant to abandon them. He had meant to save them, but even the brightest light, when withdrawn too long, casts only shadow. The first cinders had become flame, slow, patient, unseen, and somewhere among the stars, one of his remaining sons was already preparing to strike the match that would set the galaxy ablaze. The records of that day were erased long before the Horus heresy, long before the ecclesiarchy rewrote history in hymns of half-truths. Only fragments remain, scraps of data encrypted in Mechanicus vaults, a handful of forbidden verses whispered by rogue remembrancers, and the silent dread of those who still serve within the palace. But to those who heard the chain song of fire, to those who lived it, there was no forgetting. They called it the Day of Burning. It began on a nameless world at the edge of the Segmentum Solar, a planet whose coordinates no longer exist in any charted archive. Its surface was black and glassed, its atmosphere thin and metallic as though it had already been judged. The Emperor had come there in person, his golden form descending through the ash clouds with a host of custodians at his side. None were told why. None dared to ask. The few who survived said his face was hidden, not by helm but by light so bright it made the soul ache to behold. The legions had been summoned, or what remained of them. Not all sons were called, only those whose loyalty had been questioned, those whose worlds had burned too brightly, those whose ambition had begun to reach where it should not. They came in silence, their fleets arrayed in orbit like stars preparing for eclipse. Even then, some believed it was a parley, a chance for forgiveness. But there was no forgiveness left in him. The Emperor stood upon the plains of black glass where nothing lived, where even the wind had forgotten how to move. The custodes formed ranks behind him, their armor gleaming like burnished suns. Opposite them, the gathered legions, rows upon rows of post-human warriors, their banners scarred from 1,000 victories. The air between them was electric, heavy with the scent of ozone and promethium. No speech was given. No decree was read, only silence and the unbearable weight of it. The Primarchs who stood before him felt that silence more keenly than any blade, for in his stillness they saw what they truly were. Flawed mirrors of perfection, sons that had failed the image of their father. Then the light came. It was not fire as mortals understand it. It was creation unbound, raw energy torn from the fabric of reality itself, sculpted by will and sorrow into a storm that devoured the horizon. The custodies shielded their visors. Even they could not look directly upon it. The Emperor raised his hand and the world obeyed. The first wave struck without warning. Entire battalions vanished, reduced to shadows burned into the obsidian plain. Titans melted like wax. The very air screamed as molecules split apart under the pressure of his wrath. Some say the fire sang, a terrible, beautiful melody that sounded like the last heartbeat of stars. Others said it wept. One Primarch, his name now lost to all history, stepped forward, pleading through the storm. "Father," he cried, "you made us to be more than men. You made us to be you. Why do you unmake what you have made?" The Emperor did not answer. His eyes, twin suns behind the radiance, were filled not with hatred but with something worse, grief too deep to show. He had not come as judge but as executioner, and executioners do not explain their mercy. The earth cracked beneath his power. The planet's crust broke open like glass under flame, its core bleeding molten light. One by one the legions fell, not in rebellion but in disbelief, unable to comprehend the hand that destroyed them. Their screams were swallowed by the burning. The Primarch who had spoken last vanished in that light, his armor dissolving into molten gold. Only his voice remained, carried on the vox until even static turned to silence. You will have no suns left to burn. When the fire dimmed, the world was gone. Its orbit was reduced to dust and radiation, its name stricken from every record. Of the legions who stood before him, only ashes remained, drifting through the void like incense before a god too terrible to worship. The custodes, their armor scorched and their eyes hollow, knelt in silence. None dared look upon the emperor as he turned to leave. Witnesses say his light flickered then, not in weakness but in sorrow. For though he had destroyed the corruption that threatened his dream, he had also burned the love that had given it meaning. On Terra, the sigillite wept when he received the transmission. He did not speak for 3 days, and when at last he did, his words were recorded in a sealed archive that no mortal has opened since. The Father has killed the sons of fire, and in doing so he has kindled the flame that will one day consume us all. That was the day the Emperor of mankind stopped being a father, and became a god who burned what he loved most. When the fire ended, there was no sound, no storm, no scream, only the silence that follows when something greater than life has been extinguished. The world beneath the Emperor's feet no longer existed as matter. It had become memory made dust, a vast plain of vitrified glass stretching into the black of space. Those who stood with him, the custodes, the sigillite, the few Terran psychers strong enough to endure his presence, could not speak. To witness that act was to glimpse the shape of divine agony. The Emperor's armor still burned with residual light, each plate etched with the silhouettes of those who had fallen before him. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the unbearable act of will it took to remain standing. The power he had unleashed was more than destruction. It was correction, the obliteration of potential, the rewriting of creation's own script. The suns who had turned from his path had been erased not only from existence but from the memory of the galaxy itself. Even now, as his light dimmed, the Mechanicum's databanks rewrote their archives. Vox records fractured, pict feeds dissolved into static. The very fabric of reality denied they had ever been. Only he remembered. The custodian Arcadian, the same who would one day guard the golden throne in silence, stepped forward through the scorched air. His armor was cracked, his spear warped from proximity to the blast. He knelt before the Emperor and dared to speak. My lord, they are gone. The Emperor's gaze turned toward him, and Arcadian's mind filled with visions too vast to comprehend. Cities burning under twin suns, brothers laughing in the light before the first war, hands reaching for perfection only to grasp their own undoing. They are not gone, the Emperor said, his voice quieter than wind. They are within me now. Every flaw, every failure, every fire I lit. He looked out across the void, where the ashes of his sons drifted like motes of gold. Tell me, custodian, what is a father when his children burn by his own hand? Arcadian did not answer. There were no words for the grief of gods. When they returned to Terra, the palace was dark. The sky above the cradle of humanity wept ash for 7 nights. No proclamation was made, no record entered. Yet every servant of the throne, every soldier, every serf who felt the Emperor's will in the back of their mind, knew that something vast had died. The Imperium had lost its soul, though none could name the wound. In the vaults of the Mechanicus, Magos Dominus Athec began receiving corrupted transmissions, fragments of binary liturgy carried on impossible frequencies. They spoke in recursive code, repeating phrases like prayers. We are the light that forgot to die. The fire remembers. He purged the files, sealed the archives, and took a vow of silence. But that night, as he stood beneath the stars, he swore he saw 2 unfamiliar constellations flare and fade in unison. He recorded their disappearance as signal decay, though his final entry read differently. They were brothers. The Emperor said nothing. He did not mourn in any way mortals could understand. Instead, he withdrew deeper into his work. He began construction of what would one day become the Golden Throne, not as a seat of power, but as a cage. Its purpose, known only to him and the sigillite, was to contain the storm of his own making. Every soul destroyed upon that nameless world, every echo of their existence still lived within him, voices whispering in the corners of his divine mind. They could not die fully. They were his blood, his design, his curse. The sigillite once dared to ask if the act had been necessary. The Emperor looked at him with eyes that no longer reflected light. "Necessity is not mercy," he said, "but mercy breeds disobedience. What choice does a creator have when his creations begin to create gods of their own?" Across the galaxy, the remaining Primarchs continued their wars, ignorant of what had transpired. But some felt it. On distant fronts, two of them woke in the same hour, hearts pounding with phantom pain. They could not explain why. They only knew they had lost something ancient and irreplaceable. One cursed the Emperor's name in his private sanctum. Another prayed for the strength to never understand. Years later, those same two would meet again. One as traitor, one as executioner, and neither would remember why their blades shook at first sight. The memory of the day of burning had been erased from mortal history, but it lingered in the warp, a psychic scar upon the Emperor's soul. Every act of rebellion that followed, every moment of doubt in his sons was born from that day. For in burning them, he had taught them how to defy. The custodians would later say that the Emperor's light changed after that day. It grew colder, harder, less human. The warmth that once drew loyalty now inspired only awe. They did not serve a father anymore. They served a force of will made flesh, and though no one dared to speak it, the truth endured in silence. The Emperor had not destroyed the corruption that might one day consume mankind. He had only delayed it. The first fire had been quenched, but its embers, scattered across the stars, would one day ignite the greatest war humanity had ever known. That day, the day of burning, marked the end of creation's innocence. And in the heart of the master of mankind, something vast and eternal cracked. The gods had wept once. They would never weep again. The galaxy celebrated even as it decayed. To the masses of the Imperium, the Great Crusade continued without interruption. New worlds were brought to compliance. Old faiths were buried beneath the black banners of the Aquila. Yet unseen by the countless billions who labored in the Emperor's name, a great emptiness had settled over the legions. They did not speak of it, but they felt it. An absence like a phantom limb, the silent shape of brothers who had once marched beside them and were now less than ghosts. The Emperor no longer stood among them. He remained upon Terra, locked within the vaults beneath the palace, his light veiled behind storms of data and silence. The Sigillite oversaw the administration of the Empire, but the legions were fatherless now. They waged their wars as they always had, yet something in their victories rang hollow. The laughter that once filled the Strategium decks was gone, replaced by ritual and exhaustion. Each campaign felt like a repetition of the last, the same conquest, the same burning cities, the same kneeling crowds begging for a unity they no longer understood. Among the Primarchs, the change was worse. The two erased brothers had left a wound that festered behind the veneer of duty. None dared name them, but every conversation circled around their absence like ships orbiting a dying star. When one Primarch asked why their names were struck from the archives, another would answer only with silence. A few still defended their father, insisting his wisdom was beyond mortal comprehension. Others began to doubt whether he still saw them as sons at all. And in that silence, pride returned. Pride sharper now, colder. Horus Lupercal was the first to name the thing aloud. He spoke quietly in the shadowed halls of his flagship to his captains. "We fight for unity," he said, "but the one who promised it has withdrawn into solitude. Tell me, brothers, what unity exists when the father no longer looks upon his children?" None dared answer him, but every man in that chamber felt something shift inside his chest, a wordless understanding they could not deny. Others began to follow. The seeds that had smoldered since Orestes now took root. The Emperor's silence was no longer seen as wisdom. It was interpreted as judgment, or worse, abandonment. His sons, created to conquer, had been left to stagnate in their triumph. And so they began to dream again, of empires in their own image, of gods that listened when called upon. On Mars, the Mechanicum whispered that the Emperor's voice had fallen quiet in their machine spirits. In the void between stars, navigators reported strange harmonics threading through the Astronomican's light, echoes of the same chain song that had once heralded destruction. It was faint, almost forgotten, but enough to make psychers tremble in their sleep. They said the fire still lived buried deep beneath Terra, and that it stirred whenever the Emperor's name was spoken with doubt. Arcadian, the custodian who had knelt before the Emperor on the day of burning, remained stationed at the palace. He alone among the golden ranks still felt the pulse of that buried light, a faint rhythmic heartbeat that echoed through the floor beneath the throne. It was not constant. It came and went like a breath. He never spoke of it to the others, for he knew what it meant. The fire the Emperor had unleashed had not been extinguished. It had only been buried. Each night Arcadian would descend into the lower sanctums to the place where the bedrock still bore the marks of the first design. He would kneel upon the cold stone and listen. The hum was faint, but it was growing stronger. Once he thought he heard words, not spoken but remembered. "We are within you." He rose and left without speaking, though his gauntlets trembled. The Imperium was perfect now, or so the Administratum proclaimed. The stars had been tamed, the legions unmatched, the Mechanicum obedient. Perfection had been achieved, but it was perfection bought with erasure. The Emperor's sons still fought his wars, but their triumphs were hollow echoes, their loyalty a mask hiding the slow rot of understanding. They had seen what he was capable of. They had seen what perfection demanded, and somewhere in that realization, love curdled into fear. Those who still dreamed of humanity's salvation began to question whether salvation was ever the goal. Others, darker of mind, began to envy the brothers who had been erased, for perhaps, they whispered, their destruction had been mercy. Arcadian watched it unfold in silence. He saw the tension in the custodian's eyes when the Emperor's name was spoken. He saw the shadows beneath the sigillite's calm. He knew that something vast was gathering again, not rebellion, not fire, but something older, inevitable. It would come slowly, as all catastrophes do. First as silence, then as doubt, then as war. And when that day came, Arcadian knew. The Emperor's fire would return, not as judgment, but as consequence. There is a kind of quiet that follows divine acts, a stillness that seems holy until one realizes it is only the echo of something broken. The Imperium basked in that silence, blind to the truth that perfection is a wound disguised as peace. Beneath the banners and processions, beneath the hymnals that praised the Emperor's name, the cracks widened. Humanity had become a choir that sang in unison out of fear, not faith. The Emperor's sons fought on, but their wars had become rote, campaigns without conviction, glories without purpose. Every planet brought to compliance was a repetition of the last. Cities burned, governors executed, relics seized, banners raised. The process was no longer creation. It was maintenance. The dream had calcified into routine, and as the fire of inspiration dimmed, the shadow of resentment grew. In the outer reaches, the 8th Legion whispered that the Emperor no longer guided them. The 5th built shrines in secret, not to the master of mankind, but to the memory of their own Primarch. Others, still loyal, refused to speak of what they had begun to feel, that the Emperor's silence had become unbearable. They prayed for a word, even a single command, but received only the hum of the Astronomican pulsing like a heartbeat in the void. Horus dreamed. He would never tell the others. Not then, but his dreams were filled with fire, not the consuming flame of destruction, but the golden inferno that had once washed over a world now erased. In his visions he saw shadows standing in the light, faces that blurred as he reached for them. He heard voices calling out not in anger but in longing, "We were your brothers once." When he awoke, his heart thundered as though struck by lightning. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the warp, a phantom of fatigue. But part of him knew better. The lost sons were not gone. They lived in the memory of every Primarch, embedded like shards in their souls. The Emperor had erased them from the galaxy, but not from his bloodline. And so the wound he had carved into creation bled still, unseen but unstoppable. On Terra, Arcadian felt it too. The hum in the vaults beneath the throne had grown stronger. What had once been a faint whisper was now a pulse that resonated through the bedrock, through the palace, through the bones of every custodian stationed there. He heard it in his dreams in the rhythm of his own heart. Sometimes it spoke as if the stone itself remembered. He burned us to preserve his lie. Arcadian began to fear the throne. He had watched it take shape, the monumental engine of golden circuitry and godlike architecture. It was no longer a construction. It was a tomb in waiting. He saw the Emperor's servants bringing relics to its base, fragments of psychic amplifiers, proto-soul matrices, even remnants of burnt gene steel, pieces of the legions that had been destroyed. They were integrating them into the design. The Emperor had not cast them aside completely. He was binding them into the foundation of his final work. When Arcadian dared to ask the Sigillite about it, Malcador only looked at him with tired eyes. Every empire, he said, is built on the bones of its architects. Even gods need ghosts to hold their thrones. Arcadian understood then that the Emperor's perfection was not the absence of flaw, but the mastery of concealment. Every act of divine order required sacrifice so immense that none could be permitted to see it. The erasure of his sons was not a failure of love. It was the price of ascension, and still the hum grew louder. Across Mars, forges flickered with spontaneous surges of golden light. Adepts whispered of machines awakening, their spirits murmuring words long forgotten. A rumor spread that one of the lost legions still lived, not in flesh but in the data echoes of the throne itself. The tech priest called it a delusion, a memory ghost, but in their private logs they named it the residue of the first fire. In the coldest halls of Terra, Arcadian listened to that residue. He could feel it in the vibration of his armor, in the gold dust that never left his hands, and though he tried to banish the thought, it grew impossible to ignore. The Emperor's act of burning had not ended the flaw in creation. It had only folded it inward, embedding the fire within the structure of the Imperium itself. The ghost of perfection still haunted the machinery of man, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes, when the palace was silent, Arcadian thought he heard another heartbeat beside his own, deep, deliberate, and steady. It came from the vaults below, from the same place where the Emperor worked unseen. It did not frighten him anymore. It felt almost human. On the 5th night of his vigil, he descended into the sanctum and found the fissures glowing faintly again, as though something beneath the throne was breathing. He knelt as he always did, but this time he whispered aloud, "My lord, do you still hear them?" For the first time there was an answer. Not in sound, not in words, but in pressure. A pulse that rolled through the stone like a sigh. It was neither denial nor affirmation. It was acknowledgement, and in that instant Arcadian understood. The Emperor's sons had not been erased to protect the Imperium. They had been absorbed into it. Their ashes were the foundation, their deaths the mortar. The fire that had destroyed them now powered the heart of humanity's God. The Emperor had not merely burned his sons, he had become them. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, the universe held its breath, waiting for the moment when the ashes of perfection would rise once more. There are places in the galaxy where sound cannot travel, where silence becomes a presence, vast and aware. The vault beneath the golden throne was one such place. There, far below the shining halls of the palace where mortal light dared not reach, the air itself seemed to remember the sound of burning. Even now, 10,000 years after the day of fire, that silence endured, patient as a god awaiting its next breath. Arcadian had served in that silence longer than any man should. His armor had lost its sheen, his laurels dimmed by dust, yet he remained unmoving, sentinel to the chamber that housed the Emperor's living death. He no longer counted days. The pulse beneath his feet had replaced time. It came and went like a tide, a steady rhythm that was not quite mechanical, not quite divine. He knew it now for what it was, the echo of the Emperor's heartbeat, amplified through the machinery that kept him tethered to existence. But sometimes, rarely, terribly, he thought he could hear another rhythm beneath it. Something slower, something deeper. When the Emperor had ascended the throne, the custodians had believed they were guarding the pinnacle of creation. The act was told as a story of sacrifice and salvation, the Emperor binding himself to the Astronomican to guide mankind forever. But Arcadian knew the truth. He had seen the construction of the throne, had carried the relics of the erased legions into its foundations. He had heard the hum beneath the metal long before it sang. The throne was not a beacon. It was a prison, a containment of something too vast, too terrible to ever die. And within that containment, something dreamed. The Astronomican's light flared brighter than usual that cycle. Across Terra, psychers screamed in unison, blood pouring from their eyes as their minds filled with visions of a burning man who wept molten gold. The choirs of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica collapsed, their souls scorched by contact with what they could not comprehend. The Mechanicus recorded a surge in psychic resonance originating from the throne itself. A fluctuation so immense that for 3 minutes, the Astronomican's beacon split into 2 distinct signals before merging again. When the tremor passed, Arcadian knew the Emperor had stirred. He descended to the lower sanctum, where the air shimmered with the scent of ozone and incense. The throne loomed above him, a monolith of gold and bone, cables running from it like veins of a slumbering god. The light around it flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At the base of the dais, the fissures had opened again, faint golden mist bleeding upward from the cracks. Arcadian fell to one knee. "My lord," he whispered. "It returns." The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. He closed his eyes and let the pulse move through him. For a moment he could feel everything. The faint thrum of reactors beneath the palace, the distant cries of pilgrims, the warp storms howling against the void, and within it all a whisper, soft, ancient, familiar. "We remember." Arcadian's breath caught. "You cannot. You are gone." The whisper came again, stronger now, layered with many voices, a harmony of sorrow and defiance. "We are the fire that he buried. We are the thought he silenced. We sleep in his shadow." A flash of light burst through the fissures, searing white and gold. For an instant, Arcadian saw shapes forming within it. Not men, but outlines of giants, faces he did not know yet somehow recognized. The lost sons, the burned legions. Their presence filled the air with unbearable weight. He wanted to fall, to flee, but his legs would not obey. "He made us part of him," the voices said, "and in him we still burn." The light dimmed, leaving only the faint hum once more. Arcadian remained kneeling, his armor smoking, his lungs filled with the scent of iron and ozone. He understood then what the fire truly was. It was not merely destruction. It was inheritance. The Emperor had not destroyed his sons to erase them. He had consumed them. Their will, their strength, their flaw, all bound into his essence to fuel the throne. Their deaths had not been the end of rebellion. It had been its beginning. Far above, the Astronomican pulsed again, brighter than ever, its golden beam piercing the void like a spear. Every ship that sailed its light that day reported strange interference, a rhythm within the signal, almost musical, like the hum of chains dragged through heaven. On Mars, a tech priest awoke from sleep and began to write uncontrollably upon a data slate, his hands moving faster than thought. When he looked down, the script he had written was in no language known to man, yet he recognized its cadence. The canticle of the first fire, and on Terra, in the depths of the palace, Arcadian stood alone before the throne. He felt the weight of all history pressing upon him, the creation, the burning, the silence that followed. His hands shook as he raised his spear and whispered, "If you hear them still, my lord, if their fire lives within you, then what is it that burns when you dream?" The only answer was light, a soft golden light that flickered once across the vast chamber, not from the Emperor's form, but from the cracks beneath his throne. The fire was stirring again. The golden light beneath the throne pulsed once more, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of a dying god unwilling to yield. The sound was too low for mortal hearing, yet Arcadian felt it in his bones. Each vibration coursed through the marble floor and into his armor, into his very blood. It was not mechanical. It was not the hum of power conduits or psychic relays. It was alive. He remembered the words that had haunted him for centuries. When gods sleep, their weapons dream. The Emperor had silenced the chain song long ago, but now it had begun again, soft and slow, rising from beneath. The throne like breath returning to a corpse, a custodian turned toward the shadowed chamber where the throne's vast mechanisms met the bedrock of Terra. The fissures there glowed like veins of buried sunlight, the same pattern that had once carved across the plains of that nameless world on the day of burning. The Emperor's sons were gone, set all but one, yet their presence lingered here not as ghosts but as memory made matter. The Emperor had not buried his failure. He had built upon it. Arcadian approached the cracks. The air shimmered with golden dust, motes that drifted upward and dissolved into light. Within the radiance he thought he saw faces, not full, not real, but suggestions of form. Eyes like dying stars, voices whispering in unison, "We are his shadow. We are what he could not destroy." He fell to his knees, head bowed, You were burned, he murmured. Your name's erased. How can you still be? The voices rippled through the chamber. You cannot erase the act of creation. The flame that birthed us burns still within him, within all mankind. He caged us in his light, but light remembers its fire. Arcadian's breath came ragged. If this is truth, he whispered, then the Emperor, he is not the god we thought. He is the sum of all his sins, the voices answered. He burned the imperfect to become eternal. He devoured love to make order. He silenced his sons to speak as law. We are what remains of that silence. The custodian staggered to his feet. If you are his shadow, why stir now? The galaxy has suffered enough under his name. The fissures flared. The chamber brightened until his visor dimmed to black. Because the shadow is awakening. Because the light weakens. Far above on Terra's surface, the skies darkened. The Astronomican's beam flickered. Vox networks failed. Astropaths fell into seizures as their minds were filled with visions of fire. Golden fire turning white hot, consuming the palace itself. For hours, the Emperor's psychic radiance blazed across the warp like a supernova. Some claimed to hear a voice carried on the storm. They were mine. They are still mine. Arcadian stood trembling before the throne as the golden storm raged. Every surface vibrated. The custodians outside the chamber fell to their knees, blood streaming from their eyes. Statues cracked, banners ignited, and still the hum deepened. He understood then. The Emperor was fighting not against demons or time or the decay of his body, but against himself. Against the memory of the sons he had consumed. Against the fire that still lived within him. The day of burning had never ended. It had simply been paused, suspended in the eternity of the Emperor's will. Arcadian raised his spear. Its golden haft, etched with the oaths of the custodies, felt heavier than it ever had before. He looked up at the throne, at the figure seated upon it, unmoving yet infinite. My lord, he said softly, you burned your children for the Imperium. You became the god they feared. But if the shadow now wakes within you, then perhaps... He hesitated, trembling. Perhaps even gods must be forgiven. The light flared once more, a single blinding pulse. And then, silence. When Arcadian's vision cleared, the chamber was still. The fissures had closed. The light beneath the throne was gone. Yet the hum remained, softer now, rhythmic, almost peaceful. He rose slowly, uncertain whether what he had witnessed was revelation or madness. Across the galaxy, the Astronomican stabilized. The warp storms quieted. The Emperor's light returned to its steady burn. To the Imperium above, it was another miracle, proof of his eternal vigilance. But deep beneath the palace, Arcadian knew the truth. He turned to leave the sanctum. As he passed beneath the archway, he paused. On the wall, where the golden light had once danced, a faint mark remained. The outline of a sigil long erased from every archive. A legion's emblem, burned into the stone as if by memory itself. He reached out and traced it with his gauntlet. The metal was warm to the touch. Rest, he whispered. You have served enough. The mark pulsed once beneath his hand and then faded. Above, the Emperor sat upon his throne, motionless, radiant, unknowable. To the faithful, he was eternal. To the heretic, he was horror. But to Arcadian, the last witness of the chain song, he was something else entirely. Not a god, not a man, a shadow cast by his own light, and in that shadow, the ashes of perfection still glowed faintly, patient, waiting, remembering. For though gods may silence their creations, fire never forgets the shape of what it burns.